Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the spiritual gathering of Southminster Steinhauer United Church, where we are a spiritual community gathered together. We're coming to you today, February the 6th, 2022, from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. We are an inclusive and affirming community that explores an expansive spirituality. We explore our highest and best human values. The goal at Southminster is to create a safe space for all. And as we say on the website, that includes all sizes, all ages, all colors, all cultures, all genders, all sexualities, all religions or none, all types and all people. And for reasons of COVID health and safety, there are no in-person gatherings taking place right now. So this morning we only have a very few people in the building to bring you this live stream. One of the ministry team, Nancy, is away on sabbatical right now. She is having an opportunity to do some writing and to gather together some themes that have been worked with the last little while. And also, of course, to take some much-needed R&R after 2 years of ministry in a pandemic. And our other ministry team member, Chris, is taking some time away this week to be with his family following the death of his dad last Sunday. Our pianist today is Katie Alexander, and we're very grateful for the tech crew of Noah New working in the booth to bring you all the details of this live stream. My name is Nel Ouwens, and together with my partner, Curtis Tufts, we're offering some leadership today. And I should note that we're partners in ministry as well as in life, and we've pretty much been together 24/7 for the last 2 years, so we're not breaking COVID protocol to be standing up here together. Each Sunday when we gather, we honor the place where we find ourselves. As we live in Edmonton, in Alberta and Canada, we acknowledge that these are traditional meeting grounds, gathering places, and traveling routes of the Métis people of Alberta, of the Inuit, and of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples. Through Treaty 6, Canadians entered into a sacred covenant with Amiskwaski Waskahigan territory and its nations and peoples. As an act towards reconciliation, we're reminded to be part of the nations and peoples of sacred covenants, of treaties, of agreements. These all pertain to the land that we live on, and we seek to recommit ourselves to honor obligations and responsibilities to all the treaty signatories. May we always dwell together with understanding and in peace. I invite you now to turn to the candle that you have been waiting to light and to light it at the same time as I light the candle that we have here in this place. May this light be a symbol of the light and love we find in this community, whether we find ourselves together in the same physical space or together in the same virtual space. We all share in the light.
We So our winter spirituality theme for this morning is hibernation. And our Time for All Ages story, it's called Granddad's Prayers for the Earth. And I think it's a story that quite wonderfully picks up one of the key aspects of this theme of hibernation, and that would be slowing down. Slowing down and paying attention to what's going on in you and around you. There was a wise person who once said that to those who travel too fast, all things will look the same. To those who travel too fast, all things look the same. So this is a story about a boy who learned from his grandfather something about how to slow down and about what happened when he did slow down.
When I was little, my granddad was my best friend. Being with him always made the world seem just right. Granddad and I liked to go for walks in the woods together. We didn't walk very far, or very fast, or very straight. While we walked, I would ask him questions about things I wasn't sure of. "Why is it, Granddad?" I would ask. And, "What if?" And, "Does it ever?" One day, I asked my granddad about prayers. For a long time, Granddad was silent. He didn't say anything until we came to the tallest trees in the forest, and then he answered with a question.
"Did you know, boy," he whispered, "that trees pray?"
I listened closely, but I couldn't hear them.
"See how they reach for the sky," he said. "They reach and reach for clouds and sun and moon and stars. And what else is reaching for heaven but a prayer?"
I thought about the trees and kept listening for them. And while I thought, I sat down on an old mossy rock.
Rocks pray too. Pebbles and boulders and old weathered hills. They are still and silent. And those are two important ways to pray.
I thought hard about the rocks. I picked up a pebble and stuck it in my pocket. We walked a little further and came to a small stream. The water splashed and sparkled, and tiny fish hovered in the shadows. "Do streams pray too, Granddad?" I asked.
Streams pray too, and lakes, and rivers, and waters of all kinds. Sometimes they pray silently like the rocks. They lie still and calm, reflecting clouds or birds or sunsets or the first evening star. Sometimes they pray with movement, flowing across the face of the earth, giving themselves to the ocean, giving themselves to the sky, and beginning their journey all over again. Sometimes waters pray with laughter, chuckling to their friends the rocks, and sometimes they pray by dancing, leaping into the air, and falling back again. These are all ways to pray, but there are more. The tall grass prays as it waves its arms beneath the sky. The flowers pray as they breathe their sweetness into the air. The wind prays as it whispers and moans and sighs. It is saying a prayer and singing a hymn at the same time. A bird prays when it sings the first song of the morning, and it prays in that silent moment just before it sings. And the robin's last song at sundown is an evening prayer. All the beings of the world pray as they slip through the forest or sparkle in the water, as they climb mountainsides or soar into the clouds or burrow into the earth. Each living thing gives its life to the beauty of all life, and that gift is its prayer.
Then we were quiet, my granddad and I. He was watching something far away, and I was thinking about all he had said about rocks and trees and grass and birds and flowers. Finally, I asked him to tell me about the prayers of people.
People pray some of the most wonderful prayers of all. Bending down to smell a flower can be a prayer. Quietly watching the sunrise, feeling the slow turning of the earth, and saying hello to a new day is one of the oldest prayers. Standing in a snowy woods on a winter day and watching your breath become part of the breath of the world is a way to pray. Making music or painting a picture can be a prayer. Holding hands around the table with family and friends, remembering all that holds us together, and giving thanks is one of the greatest prayers. Sometimes people pray when they're sad, or sick, or lonely, or have a problem too big to carry by themselves. They may say words they have learned from their fathers or mothers or granddads or great-grandmothers, but often they must find their own words. The important thing to remember is that the words will always be right if they are real and true and come from the heart.
We had walked far enough, and Granddad said it was time to go back. But I had one last question. Are our prayers answered, Granddad? I asked.
Granddad smiled. Most of the prayers are not really questions. And if we listen very closely, often a prayer is its own answer. Like the trees and the winds and the waters, we pray because we're here, not to change the world, but to change ourselves. Because it's when we change ourselves that the world is changed.
My granddad and I went for many walks after that one, and I often listened for the prayers of the earth, but was never sure I heard them. Then one day, my granddad was gone, and no matter how hard I prayed, he didn't come back. He couldn't come back. I prayed and prayed and prayed until I couldn't pray anymore, and so I didn't for a long time. And the world seemed dark and lonely without my granddad in it. Until one day I went for a walk. I found a big rock under some tall trees and sat down on it. Overhead the branches swayed and a breeze whispered in the leaves. I heard a stream flowing nearby and a robin singing from a honeysuckle bush. And I heard something else too. Something in the sounds of breezes and birds and water. I heard prayers. The earth was praying, just like my granddad said. So I joined in. Thank you, I prayed, for tall trees and sweet flowers, for still rocks and singing birds, and especially for my granddad. And as I prayed, something changed, and my granddad seemed somehow near. And for the first time in a long time, the world seemed just right. I just have to say before I start that when you're used to speaking to a room full of people, it's a little disconcerting to have to speak to a camera, so bear with me if my eyes aren't exactly in the right place to see you. For those of us who have grown up near the majestic Canadian Rockies, the first thing that we probably think of when we hear the word hibernation is a black bear. Maybe we've been lucky enough to see a black bear along the roadside or in a mountain meadow through the summer. Or maybe we've seen them around Thanksgiving when the trees are ablaze with the colors of fall and the bears are looking sleek and slightly chubby, rambling the mountainsides and valleys, looking for that one last forgotten dried up berry patch to munch on before retiring to a den to hibernate. And maybe we've seen bears in the spring when they emerge from their dens into the melting snow, looking decidedly more scruffy after months of hibernation. And maybe the bears are judiciously watching over some little bear cubs that appear during the winter months in the den. But without a doubt, the bears are ready to go for another season of life, another season of being a bear in the mountains. Now, unless we're really lucky when we're hiking in the summer and find a deserted den, we're not generally likely to see a bear den in the wild, much less see wild bears actually in their dens during the long, long months of winter hibernation. And of course, bears aren't the only animals that hibernate. Well, technically, according to science, they don't really hibernate because their body temperature only drops a little bit and they can wake up at any moment. But we understand bears to hibernate, and other animals hibernate too, including marmots, and even a bird called a common poorwill, and bats, and lemurs, and common box turtles, and bumblebees, and garter snakes, and hedgehogs, and snails, to name just a few. Hibernation is a state of minimal activity and metabolic depression. It's characterized by a low body temperature, by slow breathing and a slow heart rate, and a low metabolic rate. It's a time of basically hiding away somewhere for a good long while in a safe space, and it most commonly occurs during the winter months, or times when the normal environment is just not as conducive to life for the species that's hibernating. Now, although people are not known to hibernate in that way, to creep away into a den in the woods, there have been times, particularly over the last couple of winters, when hibernation has seemed to me to be a really, really, really good idea. There have been times when I really would like to be able to hibernate, to basically hide away somewhere for a good long while, in a safe space, during the winter months, these many, many months when my environment, when my normal way of living just is not, or doesn't seem to be, conducive to life as I have known it. And I'm not just talking about the cold and the ice, about winter months of bad weather, although certainly that's played a part here in Edmonton. But winter in terms of minimal activity, and winter in terms of depression of all kinds, of difficult or non-existent social contacts, of worries about COVID, of worries about the healthcare system, of worries about economic stability and widespread supply chain concerns, of worries about political missteps and polarization, of worries about widespread public angers and fears, of worries about people dying without proper care, of worries about the physical and mental health and safety of all the people who are working so hard to keep our community going and to keep our community afloat. And although I know in my head that there have been global pandemics before, and there have been global economic problems before, and there have been global political instabilities and global disasters and global wars before, all of those historical things didn't quite seem to occur together and to touch me in the way that the events of the past 2 years have. Sometimes living in the world is just really difficult. So, although technically, just like a black bear, I haven't truly hibernated, there have certainly been days over the past winter when I've been hibernating in my head, staying in my flannel jammies and curled up with a blankie and a cup of hot chocolate and a book, basically hiding away my body and my mind and my spirit somewhere for a while in a safe space, safe from an environment that did not seem safe. And I'm also sure that, as John Lennon says in the lyrics to the song Imagine, that I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one that's done this winter, that's hibernated for a day or maybe longer. Sometimes we just need to retreat, just to be, to think about things, and then to come to a place where we are ready to re-emerge and re-engage with our environment as best we can and to move on with life. And the funny thing is that this idea of retreat, this idea of going away to a quiet place to think about things or to meditate, is a spiritual practice that's shared by many of the world's spiritual communities. Of course, in religious or spiritual communities, it's not called hibernation when you go away by yourself. It would be called a retreat. Times of retreat are part of spiritual practice in Hindu communities and in Jewish communities and in Christian communities, in Sufi communities, which are a mystical part of Islam, and in Buddhist communities, just to name a few. Retreats often involve solitude and times of meditation or prayer and less bodily activity. These changes in normal routine often offer those who retreat physical changes as well, in the way of slower breathing and heart rate, in the same way that hibernation does. And those who go on retreat, or who make a retreat, as it's sometimes called, often come away from that experience in a mindset to re-engage with their communities in a slightly different way than when they went away. Perhaps they've given themselves the time and the space and the opportunity to slow down and to engage some modalities within themselves that they didn't access during their usual non-retreat kind of way of interacting with their environment. 3 of the gospel writers of the Christian scriptures, Matthew and Mark and Luke, all write about a story that involves an important retreat time that the first century teacher Jesus undertook. This story is placed in the Christian spiritual record after the story of Jesus' baptism by John in the Jordan River, but before we start to read the accounts in the record of Jesus undertaking public ministry. So at the time of this story, Jesus retreated to the wilderness, which in those days, as now, could certainly have been considered a place of minimal activity and depression of life, a place of hibernation from the usual responsibilities and constraints of Jesus' community life. And in the wilderness, on retreat, Jesus wrestled with large ideas pertaining to power and to fame and to wealth, and about what it meant to be Jesus, and about how to talk about these things, and how to live out their application to life in community. Life in community as Jesus believed it could be formed. They were big questions about how to live out our common life, our highest and best human values, against a backdrop of the changing social vectors of our time. Now, physically, our world might not be that different in size than it was in the days of the Christian writers. But nowadays, we understand ourselves to be part of a far-reaching global reality that was not even imagined all those years ago. We know now that we cannot sequester ourselves from life or from each other, even if we try to build walls or develop closed border policies. Our reality is one of a deeply connected global world where what we do and experience in one place collectively affects all of us. And sometimes, particularly because of all the communication that's available to us every instant, sometimes it gets to be too much to know about all that's happening in our world. It becomes too hard, and we need to hibernate. We need to practice retreat. We need to move away to a time of stillness, of minimal activity, to a time of slowing down, to a time of healing. We need to stop and think about how to live out our common life, what it means to respond with our highest and our best human values, how we can stay present to the times and the seasons that we are in. Sometimes we do need to hibernate, to retreat. And then when we've come to rest, when we've come to a place of stillness, then we need to come out of hibernation. We need to re-engage with life to the best of our ability.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning again. I'd like to offer you now a little bit of a, I guess you might think of it as a sort of a personal case study to kind of delve a little deeper into Nell's thoughts about hibernation. And I'd like to do that by sharing with you a little bit about one of the ways that I've found in which that urge for hibernation has sort of unfolded itself and been at work in my life, especially during this pandemic era. And that is the routine of baking bread for our household. About every week or 10 days or so, I spend pretty much the entire day in the kitchen, working on a new batch of bread, usually about a half a dozen loaves at a time is my practice. Now, I've been actually baking bread for quite a few years, but like a lot of people apparently did during the pandemic, it was in the summer of 2020 that I jumped onto the bandwagon, I guess you'd say, and started my own sourdough starter. And I'm glad to report that with some regular care and and feeding, my sourdough is now 20 months old, and it's still just as lively and as fresh as ever. And if you'll forgive the pun, it seems to be ready to faithfully rise to the occasion. And because sourdough starter is alive, I actually decided that it needed a name, so I call my sourdough Uncle Jack. Uncle Jack was a favorite uncle of mine who happened to be a baker. He owned a bakery in Taber, Alberta, in southern Alberta. And whenever I think of bakers, I think of Uncle Jack. So Uncle Jack is my sourdough starter. Now, over the months, I've come to think of making bread as one of those dimensions of what I would call my personal hibernation practice. And I would even go so far as to say making bread, baking has become part of my personal spiritual practice. Now, it might sound kind of strange to talk about something like baking in that way, but I would say that bread making has become for me what in the Jewish tradition they sometimes call a mitzvah, or a personal a kind of religious observance, a spiritual observance. And I say this for a few reasons, but I would say the most important reason has to do with the ways that I find that baking bread, the making of bread, particularly using sourdough, slows me down. Now, it's quite possible, of course, to speed up the making of bread. I can use instant yeast that just works in a moment. I could use one of those hot rod stand mixers with a dough hook that does all the work. I could get myself a mechanical bread making machine, or I could save a lot of time and just drive down to the grocery store and buy it. But I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who once observed that there's more to life than simply increasing its speed. There's more to life than just increasing its speed. And I find that when I engage in this practice of making bread in this old-fashioned way with a spoon and a bowl and flour and salt and oil and milk and a ripe sourdough starter, I don't really have any choice except to go at the speed that the ingredients and the process requires. And for the most part, that is slowly. So even though it's a chore, even though it's a piece of work and something that needs to be done, I find that baking bread has taken on for me some very clear elements of those two Hebrew notions that Chris was teaching us about in his reflection a couple of weeks ago, and that would be Shabbat, or Sabbath, rest, stopping work, not doing anything. And then you remember that notion of Sabbath was paired together with another word, nuach, which is that sense of settling in, of settling down. Now, whenever I think of Shabbat or Sabbath, I always remember something that I was taught by a Jewish rabbi in a workshop I was at once years ago. And he said that the practice of keeping Sabbath is not actually something that should just be confined down to one day a week. He said Sabbath keeping needs to take in, to expand, and to embrace and permeate the whole of the week, all 7 days. So he said there are 3 days leading up to the Sabbath. So Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, leading up to the Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. And on those days, we're preparing. We're getting ready. We plan. We get the necessary things that need to be there. We get them in place. We clear away the space. We clear away the time so that the Sabbath can happen. Then there's the actual day of Sabbath, the Saturday in Jewish practice. But then even after the Sabbath is over, and there are still 3 more days, according to this rabbi, even as you move back into the routines of your work and whatever it is you're doing, there are 3 more days, he says, So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, when you, as he put it, you bask in the glory of the Sabbath rest, when you enjoy the lingering kind of blessings that come from that time of rest. And how did the fourth commandment put it? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, when I'm baking bread, particularly sourdough, I find that something very much that, like that multi-day practice, Sabbath practice that the rabbi was talking about, something like that happens for me. And so I need to keep kind of track of the days. And I know sort of what our bread supply is like in the household. And I begin to plan my baking day. And I make sure that I have all the ingredients that I need, literally the flour and all the rest. I have to watch the calendar and keep the day clear because I know how long it's going to take. And then sort of like the Jewish Sabbath practice that starts at sundown on Friday, my baking day actually begins the day before. When I get the sourdough starter out of the refrigerator, I measure out what I need. I feed the sourdough with more flour and warm milk. I feed what's left in the jar with more flour and milk. And I put them both in a warm place and cover them up so they rest overnight. And the sourdough starts to activate. And this is what it looks like when I take it out in the morning. It's alive again. It's bubbling and it's going. And the next morning, the starter jar goes back into the fridge for next time, and the actual baking process begins. The clearing of the space, gathering up the ingredients, and then there's the measuring and the stirring and the blending and so on. And all of this, as I say, is out of necessity a slow process, especially when I'm working in that kind of old-fashioned, stirred by hand kind of way. So there's stirring in the ingredients and the flour and the other things. It takes a good 10 minutes. Kneading the dough until it's smooth and elastic, as all the recipes will tell you. That takes another 20 minutes. Then there are several points through the course of the baking day when, for all intents and purposes, everything kind of comes to a halt and you're not doing anything. So it says, turn the lump of dough out onto the counter, onto the board, cover it up, and let it rest for 30 minutes. Or shape the kneaded dough into a ball, place it in a bowl and cover it up, and let it rise in a warm place until it's doubled in size, maybe 1 or 2 hours. Then you punch down the dough, and you shape it into loaves, and you prepare it, put it in the pans, and you cover them up and let them rise maybe 60 minutes. And then, of course, eventually you get to the place the dough in the pans. Preheat the oven to 375 and bake for 30 to 35 minutes. And you know what I've found is that for me, what I would call the hidden blessing of all this intentional and careful slowness is that I'm learning to practice that Sabbath nuach that Chris was teaching us about. Or in other words, that mitzvah, that spiritual observance of simply settling down and settling in. As I'm caught up in the slowness of this practice, the slowness of the process, I found that I'm learning to slow myself down. I'm learning how to settle in to myself, how to let go of the urgency, the impatience, letting go of the have-tos and the need-tos and the should-dos and the must-haves. And all those things are always ready and waiting to kind of well up inside me and distort and twist my time and my days. So slowing down, settling in, nuach. And then just as a kind of a side note here, I should add that one of the other things that I like to do that I think really kind of deepens and enriches that nuach, that settling in time, is to make use of those times of waiting that are built into the bread-making process. When the dough is resting and during the 2 different rising times, and then the final time for baking, to take that time to sit down and to write a letter to a friend. And some of you might remember that old-fashioned kind of letter that I'm thinking of here. I'm not talking about an email where you dash it off and you hit the send button, but an actual letter. The ones that you use where you use a pen and paper, and you write on a piece of paper and you tell some story about your life and about your work, your joys and your sorrows, your fears, your delights. And then when you're done the letter, you put it in an envelope and you put a stamp on it and you walk to the mailbox and you drop it in, and your friend gets that letter some days later. And they smile when they see your handwriting, your familiar handwriting on the envelope. And they go home and they open it up and they sit down with a cup of tea in a comfy chair and they slowly read and reread your words. And they're reminded again of you and of their connection with you and your friendship. And all of that sort of offers me and the one that I'm writing to another rich kind of slowing down and settling in. And then, of course, sometime later in the afternoon, usually when it's all over and things are cleared up, the house will be full of a wonderful aroma, and the bread will come out of the oven, and if all went well and you did everything as required, slowly but surely, then you get to share in another kind of special blessing. And as the rabbi suggested when he was speaking about keeping Sabbath through the whole week, I find that this kind of spiritual blessing and spiritual practice offers blessings that call out to be shared with other people, and that indeed can last for some days, long after the oven has cooled off, and long enough to last until the next day of baking comes around. So that's my hibernation practice, and I would highly commend it to you to try, and invite you to give it a try. But invite you also to ponder on the ways that you might learn and allow yourself to slow down and to settle into your own Shabbat Nuach. And maybe we could swap recipes.
Often when we've spent time meditating and thinking about things, we strengthen our intentions by drawing our thoughts together in words of prayer. I invite you to speak these words with me or just to listen as they're read for you. The world is one. We are one. When one celebrates, we all celebrate. When one suffers, we all suffer. May we ever seek new ways to be support and encouragement for one another, affirming the worth of each person. May we always celebrate the wonder and wisdom of our place, one among many, in this planet's natural diversity. May we discover every day ways to honor the value and uniqueness of each person's experience, journey, and story. In the beauty of community, in our need for each other, we pray as those born of light. Amen.
It's the wonder of life.
Well, we've come to the end of this time together, which means that it's time to change the light. So I invite you at home to blow out your own candle, as I will here. Just as the smoke from that puffed out flame always seems to take its time to gradually rise and stretch out and linger on, so that you can't quite be sure as it's doing that when it's completely or really gone. So may the blessings and the boons of this time we've shared, this particular moment of Sabbath, also linger with each of us through this day and all the days to come, until we gather once again. Farewell.